This is for Anthropology 205. This is our discussion board number 2. This concerns The Lost Boys of Sudan, a film we watched. It's on the National Geographic Channel for some years. It's been some years now, but it's very applicable. The first question that we're to answer is what reasons provoke migration of the lost boys and girls from their homeland in southern Sudan to refugee camps in Ethiopia and Kenya. After the British left Sudan, the Arab North and Black Christian South were treated as a whole. As a result of this, a civil war broke out over oil and religion in 1983. In 1987, the government issued a decree that all male children in the South were to be killed. It's pretty safe to say that their aim was to make the remaining Black Christian South weak and vulnerable in order to seize control of the area. About 27,000 males, some only a few years old, fled the area on foot to survive. They first went to Ethiopia and then to Kenya. What have you learned? Number 2, what have you learned about the Dinka culture? From this film, we learned that the Dinka population holds dear to their biblical Christian faith with a God who watches over them. They're a collective society that does everything in groups and cares for its members and homeland. As in most groups, natural leaders emerged during their trek who had an innate sense of responsibility and commitment to each other in the group. Although they lost their families of origin, the boys did come together as a new family of lost boys. What appears to be their norm, despite of their circumstance, is that they did realize the importance of group music and dance and a common language for survival. The leaders prompted song and dance as well as communication amongst the group every time they met. They encouraged everyone to discuss what was on their minds and what they were feeling. Most of us know that in so doing, they did facilitate their own healing process. I am not familiar with the Dinka language, but it does seem to be a very expressive language. For example, what we might consider screeching or squeals seem to be a form of rejoicing that can best be exampled when John finally gets to see his mother after a 17-year absence. The lost boys and girls are shown in this film dancing in circular groups, chanting and singing in their native language. In so doing, all individuals are brought together into a collective group. This gives them a strength that they would not have had alone. It is also interesting to see that once settled, the boys established their form of parliamentary government. I think this indicates their familiarity with the British system of government and process. They understood the importance of leadership as well as rules. Because they called it their White House, we can also safely assume that they were familiar with the U.S. before the war and had some idea of how our democratic country operates. Everyone had a say and a role in the government with responsibilities. Although many boys and men did die along the way, the sheer number of those who survived and have since thrived is also an excellent example of how critical the formative first 5 years of a child's life are. Many of them, even at such a young age, already possess the knowledge and skills and good health needed to ensure their survival in the event of catastrophic devastation. Number 3, what questions and fears do the lost boys have about life in the U.S.? Some of the very basic questions the boys wondered about life in the U.S. was practical. What was a shower? What was electricity? And what foods would they be eating? They wondered if they would survive and what would become of those who did not go to the U.S. They wondered what they would do and if Americans would like them. Some of the challenges the lost boys met were primarily in learning how everything worked, such as phones, electricity, and how to cook their meals. They had to wait until they had Social Security numbers before they could apply for jobs, and since our government only provided 3 months of income, they had to find their jobs as soon as possible. They had to learn to take a bus, find a job, budget their money, and learn what is shared and what is not. Because some of them most of them were already English speakers, thanks to the UN's English-speaking lessons that they did give them in Africa when they found them, they didn't seem to have as many language barriers as other refugees and refugee communities I've either known or known about. The lost boys seem to have been welcomed into the communities that took them, and the film shows they participated in many community activities. Some of the differences exampled in the film were confusion that the boys had as to why Americans just simply don't go visit each other's homes and why some of them are not friendly to each other at all. They didn't seem to not understand that we don't have that collective group that they do in their culture. In the film, the boys spoke about their worry for the others in the camp and if their families made it through the war alive. I believe these worries and concerns are universal, and this, along with their sense of the golden rule, does exemplify and validate that belief. One of the things that stood out, and what the boys themselves pointed out, is that they purposely continued to eat with their fingers. They said it helps them retain that part of their culture and to make sure they never forget who they are or where they come from. The other larger concern the boys had was that they were advised not to travel in large groups, which that proved to be an issue in some of the towns in which they were placed. They provoked or started fear in other people, the American people. John complained in the film, however, that because there was only 4 of them and they weren't allowed to travel around in the large groups, he couldn't understand quite how they would make it. To him, it seemed that the volume, the sheer number of boys in the group equaled their strength. Over time, it seemed that the Lost Boys faced many of the same problems many of us have had to face: too many bills with too little money, and having to forego an education in order to work for our families and ourselves. This film was quick to point out that while the Lost Boys seemed to be truly appreciative of the opportunity that the United States citizens afforded them, they definitely wanted to return to Sudan and rebuild it. Life in America is not always great or easy. They did organize groups of Lost Boys locally and within their state. They typically were in 23 states, so they organized chapters and met even like a yearly and annual meeting or so. They often met to establish and determine how, as a larger goal, they would meet their goal with the ultimate goal of rebuilding a better Sudan. These goals included relocation, education, and reunification with their families and loved ones. 4 and 5 were about community building strategies that were used both in the camps and in this country. The Lost Boys took it upon themselves to educate the American public on Sudan and the war. They formed the organized groups similar to grassroots political groups with the hopes of taking their plight to the White House itself. They developed goals for the groups and agreed that as a group, which they considered themselves ambassadors from Sudan, they would do their part to ensure the safety and success for all of them. They did monitor each other when they came together. It was very interesting. Some of the younger boys that seemed to take on some of the less desirable qualities that we have in young men in this country, they made sure to point out that they felt they were not doing the right thing. In the film, they also spoke of the importance of retaining that Dinka identity and the customs, and to constantly express themselves to the American communities in which they lived. Another good example was shown in, I believe it was Pittsburgh, when Daniel found a woman. He worked in a Whole Foods store, and he found a woman who was crying, and no one seemed to approach her or know what to do. But he said he knew instinctively what to do and to do what they considered the right thing, which it is the right thing. He went to ask her about it and help her shoulder some of the burden that was causing her to cry. Number 5 was, what sense of responsibility do the Lost Boys feel towards each other and towards their families and friends still in Africa? And in what ways are they trying to improve their own lives and those of their friends and family? The Lost Boys did feel responsible for the others in their former camp Kakuma as well as their family of origin. They sent both of them money with the hopes of bringing them all to America to rebuild. John dutifully sent money both to the camps and to his original family once they were found. He did work 3 jobs at one time, the film pointed out, and they often spoke on the phone a lot. They spoke on the phone so much to the point that he did complain about the sheer number of messages on their answering machine, particularly those that were asking for money, more than he could possibly ever contribute. And our last question is, as you view the film, what do you feel about American culture as you see it through the eyes of these young Sudanese men? What questions and fears would you have if you were moving to a new country? How do those values compare with your own? And what do you think would be the greatest challenge for you in adapting to life in a new place? When I watched this film, I gained the sense that our government did what they could do while still keeping its main concern, the American people, foremost in their mind. I think that for the most part, the Lost Boys were conscious of this and were grateful for what we did for them. However, I also think they were confused and possibly angry that our government did not interfere or stop the war in Sudan. I'm guessing and hoping that by now, with continued education and experience, that they're aware that it's not quite as simple as that. Moreover, that while we do have a responsibility to other countries, it is often limited. The same goes out for seemingly unfriendliness. I believe that most people have become that way for health and safety reasons. The collectiveness of the past that we might have once had here is typically only found in small groups at this time in this country, and the uniqueness we cherish has just become a part of who we are. If I were to have to move to another country, I think my main concern would be the language barrier. I only speak the English language. Of course, it would depend on what country it was, but I don't think my values would conflict with the values of the country to the point that they could not be resolved or worked around. I do think that my greatest challenge would be in women's rights. As Americans, we take for granted many things that women in other countries cannot do or be. Therefore, I would be most concerned that my being single would be an issue, or that my relationships with my family and loved ones would not be as important to them as they are to me. I would also be concerned about my personal safety, employment, getting along with others, and the general basics of living. Thank you.